welcome to Back from the Abyss. I'm Dr. Craig Heacock. Before we start today's story, I wanted to share with you an email I got from a listener. It was really moving, and I thought you all might want to hear it. Dear Craig, I just wanted to thank you for conveying the message that if you've only ever been on SSRIs, you've never really been treated for depression. That statement is completely accurate with my experiences. SSRIs help me with short-term anxiety, but they don't help me stop crying all the time or being fatigued or wanting to end my life. I asked my GP if I could start lamotrigine, and he was apprehensive, but my psychiatrist agreed straight away. I took a microdose on Sunday night. I wasn't expecting any effects for it, at least a month of titrating up, but I started getting benefits pretty soon after I took it. I've never been as productive at work as I have been this week. I have much more mental energy. I've gone almost 3 days without crying, which is a 2-year record. I've had these issues on and off since I was a teenager. I think you've saved my life. Honestly, I had plans, not short term, but when there would be no family left to be traumatized. I'm 49. It is astonishing to be getting these effects now, but man oh man is it frustrating that none of the 30 clinicians I've sought help from, including many psychiatrists, have ever considered a mood stabilizer for me. Now, note from me here, I think you all know that I don't consider lamotrigine a mood stabilizer. In any case, it's an antidepressant. You deserve the fees I paid to all of them. Oh, no, I just deserve this letter. Thank you for writing it. What my life could have been if I'd had the right treatment in time to build a life. I've also had EMDR over the past 12 months. It's astonishing and has set me up well to get the most out of lamotrigine. Another therapy that's been around for the 3 decades that I've needed it, but it's only just been offered to me. I've told a few people about your glorious podcast, and they were really keen to be told the name of it so they could listen. I'll tell lots more people about it, I'm sure. There's so many episodes I've listened to many times and will listen to again. Thank you so much for all you do. Oh, wow. That was such a beautiful note. Thank you, all of you who email me through my website. You know, as we've talked about before, we get story suggestions and critiques and comments and people sharing their stuff and everything. It's just, in general, I hate email. It's almost my most loathed thing. But now, actually, when I check my email, I think that there might be an email from a Back from the Abyss listener, which would make it all worthwhile. Okay, let's move into our story. This is our first story about war trauma. And while we've had psychiatrists on Back from the Abyss as experts, this is also our first story where a psychiatrist other than me shares their Abyss story. Today's storyteller, Dr. Russell Carr, was a career Navy psychiatrist for 20 years and served in Iraq, where today's story begins. As Russ and I began to prepare for this recording, I couldn't help but think of my own road not traveled. Throughout my childhood and adolescence, my dad would hint to me that he was hoping for at least 3 things from me. Number 1, that I'd be a hunter and fisherman like him. Number 2, that I'd play high school football. And gosh, thank goodness I didn't. I would have been killed. And the 3rd was that maybe, possibly, I could go to the Naval Academy, because he would always say, Smedley, which is what he called me, it's the best education anyone can get, and it's free. Well, I was 0 for 3 on these wishes, and I have to say that my dad was very accepting of this over time, realizing that we were very different people, and that the Naval Academy would not have been, let's just say, the optimal growth medium for me. Fast forward to the end of medical school, and I started receiving offers to double my upcoming residency salary for the next 4 years, and all I had to do was give back a few years of service to the Navy. Part of me wanted to bite on this offer, but again, I had this gut feeling that this path would not bode well for me. Well, Russ, today's storyteller, chose the Navy path. The Navy paid for his med school, and then he did a military psychiatry residency. He got the sweet deal, free medical education, or maybe it wasn't so free after all, as we're about to hear. This story is also about a rite of passage. A rite of passage that not every psychiatrist faces, but most of us do at some point. This is the story of losing that first patient to suicide. I'll never forget my first suicide. It was actually in my last year of residency. And it literally changed the way I thought about psychiatry from that point forward. Until my first suicide, I had no idea how much despair and confusion and anger and second-guessing and guilt could overtake me. Well, at least until my next suicide. An additional note, we join Russ's story here just after he arrived in Iraq, but years after having joined the Navy, where he already carried the legacy of countless incidents of fear, overwhelm, powerlessness, and doubt during those early formative years as a Navy doc.
And so I left for Iraq 2 weeks after finishing residency. Went to training, urban combat school for Navy. It was called Navy Urban Combat School at Columbia, South Carolina. It's on an Army base, Fort Jackson. Very few doctors at it. It was mostly non-medical people. And, we were learning how to, wear our Kevlar and kick in doors and shoot people inside doors and go in as teams and stuff. And we spent a lot of time at rifle range and pistol range. And so it was very non-medical, you could say. And it started opening up. I already knew what I was going to, but really made me start thinking about it some then. And
yeah. I'm trying to imagine going from residency, helping, taking care of patients for years, and then boom, stepping into practicing to be a soldier.
Yeah.
And shoot a gun and protect yourself and fight and kill.
Yeah, and some of the enlisted Navy guys I was in this training with, they were on their second tour at least of going to Iraq or Afghanistan, and they had this whole mock little Iraqi village. There was all cinder block buildings, and we would practice being in a line by the door and a team leader kicking in the door or knocking in the door different ways, and then we'd run in as a team, and these pop-up things would come up, and you're supposed to decide in the moment to either shoot or not shoot. And we weren't using live rounds, but some of these enlisted guys would always just shoot the families and shoot the kids that would pop up and laugh about it. And I didn't really get it at the time until I had kind of gone. And after I got back, I was like, oh yeah, this sort of numbness, not really caring, callousness.
Almost like you were seeing the kind of the shutdown, the emotional numbing that had to happen to be a warrior.
Yeah, and the difference, the separation from a normal sense of life, callousness, just a lack of compassion and empathy, and
a dehumanization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I started to see that, but I didn't get it at all, and was kind of troubled. And why would they do that? And the sergeants, the Army sergeants training us would yell at them, and that would be about it. Yeah, and then I was in Kuwait for a week or so for acclimation, and it was like a hairdryer in Kuwait. Just standing in a hairdryer. This was in August. It was 120, 125, sometimes 130 in the desert. It was just standing in a hairdryer. And then I went to Iraq, and we had gone sort of as a group. I'd gotten to know some of the people, and then we were just all divided up and went to different units.
What was your day-to-day life as a psychiatrist in Iraq?
So I was on what's called a prevention team on a combat stress control unit, which I always like that name, combat stress control. We're going to control the stress of combat.
That's easy.
Yes. So I was on a base that was, by 2008, it was fairly built up in Iraq, the resources. So we were sort of consolidated onto a large supply base, logistics base right outside of Mosul called Q West. Had about 4,000 soldiers and another 3,000 to 5,000 contractors on it, which we didn't treat contractors, but just military.
But you were the only psychiatrist for those thousands of people.
Yeah, I was the only psychiatrist there, and I was also the psychiatrist for all the outlying bases, smaller bases in the area. There were only 3 psychiatrists for the American military in northern Iraq.
think the soldiers would they have to hide that they were coming to see you, that they didn't want their colleagues to know? Or was it open enough that it was okay to come talk to you?
It varies a lot by unit. Some of them, they were okay with it. They had to say they were going somewhere. They were accountable. They would say they were going to medical or something, and we were kind of across the street from a small medical clinic, so we were close. I remember there were some smaller units. There was one smaller unit where it turned out there were only like 7 or 8 people in this very small specialized unit, and I was treating all but one of them. And they were all fine with it, and they actually once, after a while, that small group, they figured out I was treating all of them, and they all got together at lunch one time and talked about like what meds they were on, and then they would come back to me saying, "Well, you have Charlie on Zoloft. Why am I on Paxil? What's the deal?" and stuff like that. But then there were others at the other extreme where even medical appointments were stigmatizing. I had soldiers tell me that their first sergeant, like their senior enlisted, would every morning when their company unit was having a meeting, they would get together at like all 100 of them and be at attention in the morning, and their first sergeant would single out everyone who had been even just to medical the day before for like a knee problem or something, and just shame them in front of everyone and call them all sorts of stuff, weak pussies. We all have knee pain. What the fuck are you going to medical for? Why are you complaining? All this sort of stuff. Much less, going to mental health. Mm-hmm. So it varied widely. Where I was on a remote base, there was no hospital there on the base I was in. There was just a small clinic with one doctor and a PA in it. For medical casualties that were beyond what they could handle, they could call in a helicopter that would come pick them up. The Army didn't see psych casualties as that serious at the time, and they would not send helicopters for them. If you were suicidal or even psychotic, unless, they were so psychotic they had to be medicated, strapped down to a gurney, then they would come get them. But otherwise, I had to handle it locally until I could get them medevaced, till I could get them removed from the base I was at, up to a military hospital, which they would have to go through like a normal flight, like that anyone would take, if I were going to that base, and that could take days to arrange. And so what we normally did was get like the first sergeant or the commanding officer, like the senior enlisted person in the unit or the commanding officer involved, and we would disable their weapon, like an M16 or an M4, the carbine version of an M16 that they would carry. I knew very easily how to take out the firing pin. Either I would do it or like the first sergeant would do it, or sometimes the soldier would do it in front of me and hand me the firing pin or hand the first sergeant the firing pin. Then they could still carry the weapon, but it couldn't fire. And we did that because it was so stigmatizing. If someone didn't have a weapon, you knew something was wrong. Mm-hmm.
So all their buddies assumed that their weapon was loaded?
Yeah, everyone walked around. You were required to, well, on base, they weren't supposed to be loaded, but you had ammo on you. Like I would have it reaching for my ammo right now in my pockets. Mm-hmm. It was still the way it was set up to get into the dining facilities to eat. You had to have a weapon. You weren't allowed in without a weapon. And so they couldn't, if we took their weapon away totally, they couldn't go eat. They were very, very rigid about that. Mm-hmm. And so we do that and put them on a watch. And so, people in their unit would end up knowing, that because they were having to rotate watching this person, for 3 or 4 days. Sometimes we could, if someone would calm down over 3 or 4 days, and they would, the reason they were suicidal would maybe they'd start to feel better about, or they'd gain a little bit of perspective. They'd keep seeing maybe one of our therapists every day during that time, and we'd be able to give them their weapon back actually, and they would be all right. And we did that quite a few times. Or others, we would have to medically evacuate from Iraq. Mm-hmm. And that would take, just to get them from our base, could take, like I said, 3, 4, or 5 days.
The first suicide is a career-changing milestone most of us psychiatrists reach, but desperately hope never to. The first suicide, it's almost always someone we would never guess, which then rocks us even more, makes us doubt ourselves, makes us question our ability to assess risk or to actually change the course of our patients' lives. It makes us question the genuineness of our treatment relationships. We don't want to admit it, but it makes us want to cry out, "How could you do this to me?"
I treated him, I saw him maybe 3 times before he killed himself. I believe, if I remember right, he came in for anger and depression. He had never really talked about suicidal thoughts until I think the last session I saw him, about 2 weeks before he killed himself. He had said he had maybe some vague thoughts, but wasn't going to act on them. You know, he had family back home. He had a wife, 2 children, but he and his wife were sort of struggling to get along. She had an extensive psychiatric history and was really struggling with their children by herself, and that was real strain on him. He was probably an undiagnosed alcoholic. You know, he had been drinking very heavily for 4 or 5 years since mid-high school, and he was in his early 20s at this point. And this was his first time in about 5 years where he was abstinent from alcohol, but he had no treatments, and he was having a lot of cravings. And I think he was also just, he just didn't have the coping skills, didn't have, a lot to fall back on because of that. But he was also considered kind of life of the party. I learned later that his soldiers in his unit considered him sort of the class clown, joked around a lot, was always fun to be around. He was well known on base, it turned out. He had a lot of friends outside his units. Yeah, and then, one afternoon we were coming back to, see patients, kind of this routine sort of clinic type setup. We learned right after lunch that he, while his unit was preparing to go on a mission, he had been on Skype with his wife, and I don't know what was discussed there, but I knew their contacts had been sort of rough. We had, the base was built up enough where people could have some internet, and we could do Skype. Back then was the big way people talked back and forth, and it could be a double-edged sword because people could have bad arguments over it as well. And while his roommate went to the latrine, he wrote a note and put a round through his chest, leaned on his rifle and blew a hole through. Turned out he took out all the great arteries above his heart, and was dead pretty quickly.
Wow. What happens after a traumatic incident can be as or more critical than what actually happened. The suicide not only devastated Russ and other soldiers on the base, but the shock waves went right up the military hierarchy, resulting in Russ immediately needing to steel himself against official investigations and inquiries, giving him no time to process or heal, but rather having his decision-making and competence repeatedly questioned and called out in front of others.
When he first told me, I had to think about who that was. I was seeing easily over 150 patients at that point. And he wasn't someone I thought of, that would kill himself. He wasn't. I had a list in my head of, 4 or 5 people on base that I thought, they could maybe kill themselves. And I was more worried about them. And he just really wasn't one of them. We were still hoping, well, maybe he's still alive. Maybe it wasn't really a serious attempt or anything, because we didn't know at that point. And then as we got word, Yeah.
I think most psychiatrists can relate to this idea of having a short list of people who you're most worried about. And then almost invariably, that's not when it goes badly with someone and they're not on the list.
I saw later a lot of psychiatrist, when I was back at Walter Reed in leadership roles, I would get involved with every time one of our psychiatrists had someone kill themselves. And a lot of times it was someone they thought was getting better, had been in a bad place and was getting better. And then suddenly some event, catastrophic event happened, and they just went back. They just couldn't take it.
Or this idea of getting better, that people get just enough energy, just enough wherewithal.
And I've thought that, or I think another thing that does happen is they think they're in the clear, they think they're doing so much better, and then this bad event happens and they feel it all over again, and they think this is never going away, or the event just resonates so deeply with, unconscious beliefs about themselves that they really are a terrible person and they really just should die.
Mm-hmm. What was the aftermath of the suicide for you emotionally, professionally, maybe reputationally there on the base?
So emotionally, everything had to be stuffed down because we had to go to work right away. We had to provide support to his unit, to the medical staff that that tried to resuscitate him, to others. Besides just seeing patients in the military, you do a lot of outreach and a lot of, we call them like walkabouts, where you'd go and just go to a unit and let them get some familiarity with you, and then you get some gauge of how the unit is doing in itself. And we go out and support units, and our boss wanted us to go out right away to help, this unit. And so we did that for most of the afternoon, and, so I went with her and one of our techs to his unit to talk to their commanding officer and see how they're doing and help them, if they wanted us to help either tell the other soldiers or to help be there to process it with any, or to see if any that were really struggling with it. And so I saw right away a lot of the chaos it was causing. I started feeling kind of guilty right away, like I should have been able to stop this. He was seeing me. It wasn't like he wasn't seeing any mental health care. He was in mental health care. He's not supposed to kill himself then. It's sort of, he's engaged in the system, and we're supposed to be able to help him. I'm supposed to be able to help him. I spent that evening doing paperwork of all things. We were getting all these phone calls, word spread pretty quickly through the military chains of command, and all these colonel psychiatrists or colonel senior physicians were calling to, brief this general or that person about what happened. And they either wanted to talk to me about it or hear some more. And our commanding officer, who was in Mosul on another base, called. He was offering some support, but at the same time, there's this report on any suicide or attempted suicide that the military wanted to fill out that's very extensive. That's like a very extensive biopsychosocial report on the person and what happened. Normally, you have 30 days to fill it out because it's very extensive. Our boss said, I need that by close of business from you, to me. So I had to do that. I was working on that till 8 or 9 at night, and our unit was all still there doing things, and it just felt like the world was closing in on us to some degree. Do
you think there's more of a culture of blame in the military than in civilian life? Because I'm just trying to, I've had a number of suicides. I've never had to fill out a report or felt like people were pointing their finger at me immediately or asking me to explain, or even worrying that people around me were going to start blaming me. When really you could imagine, if the military were going to adequately prepare psychiatrists in war or, conflict zones, they would say something like, you have a bunch of young people with incompletely developed frontal lobes with high-powered weapons in the most stressful time they'll probably ever see in their whole lives, separated from their families and loved ones. And so you are going to lose people to suicide. That is just... I'm imagining you never got that training, but it seems like that's pretty obvious. You get thousands of mostly young men with high-powered rifles and who are impulsive and very comfortable shooting those guns and away from everything they know and love.
Yeah, the training was never, it's just going to happen. It was always, yes, all those things are true and it could happen and you have to stop it. And we can put together strategies to stop it with early interventions or screenings. And, the military tried a lot of that and suicide just kept going up.
You wrote about in one of your pieces on medium.com that not only did you not really have anyone to talk to or get to sort of decompress from this, but it was kind of a full-on investigation that outside psychiatrist came and just basically micro-analyzed everything and questioned everybody to see if, in fact, you were to blame.
Yeah. So that was actually one of 3 inspections we had, and the one that impacted me most directly that happened because of the suicide. And yeah, it was supposed to be a kind of a record review, chart review, determining if standard of care was met. Because again, it was this, I could have been negligent was sort of the attitude, that I must have done something wrong. Even though there were psychiatrists and all these people were reading this guy's record, it was an electronic record, and I never thought that was quite appropriate, but a lot of these like senior colonels, different ones were like reading his record, and some of them would call me and say, yeah, you did everything right. There's nothing, did everything fine, but we have to do this investigation. And I was with an Army unit, embedded with the Army, and they felt like politically, I guess, someone from the Navy should do it and not them. Yeah, the senior psychiatrist that came, I didn't know him. I was assured it was just going to be this little record review and it wasn't that big a deal. And he showed up and said he was going to do a psychological autopsy of this guy, which there is such a thing we talk about some in the military, but that's not what he was supposed to be doing. And he interviewed people from his unit, stirred up all sorts of feelings in them that we got complaints about. He interviewed like my coworkers there, interviewed me over several hours.
This seems like the exact opposite thing you should do.
Yeah, and he was going through the intake form that the patient had filled out, saying, well, this is the only thing we have that he wrote down. He went through it line by line, questioning me. I learned later he thinks everyone has bipolar disorder. Almost every line he was asking me, well, so he got in a fight in high school. How did you know that wasn't a manic episode? How did you know he doesn't have bipolar disorder? And it just went like that the whole time. Then went through my notes and second guessing me on stuff I had written, saying, well, what did you really mean that? What did you? And yeah, it was just terrible. Then I found out after he left that he said I met standard of care and it was all right. But still, it was just brutal.
So how did you maybe change as a physician after that? I mean, this awful thing happens, but again, you didn't get this, not only support, but you get scrutinized and then sort of quietly approved, okay, you're fine. But then there you are with your thousands of people that you're still caring for.
Basically, I just had to keep going. That night when it happened, it was terrible. The night it happened, I went back to my room and was, crying, had this horrible nightmare that my son was being raped and I did nothing about it or could do nothing about it, and just woke up just bawling. But then the very next day I had to go back and act like, everything was good, and I had to just keep going and seeing people and helping people deal with what had happened. And then, there was a wide effect on the base. I ended up at least 3 patients I was already treating were very affected by it. One that was in his unit that I had thought could maybe hurt someone else. He came in just at the end of his rope, and I was struck by how all of them just felt like they imagined that the guy had killed himself was now at peace. And they loved the idea of that they could too be at peace. But then it was also just extremely disturbing and unsettling to them at the same time, because they didn't want to kill themselves. They were very ambivalent, but just so agitated by that. And so those three, I ended up, having to medevac. And again, that's like a 3 or 4 day process, and it took a long time and a lot of energy. And I was just worn out by it. And I was just being, I think, emotionally worn down. And I never really, no one in our small team, none of us had a chance to process any of this with anyone. A risk factor we know in the military for like PTSD is deploying with a unit that you don't know anyone there. You have no one to process stuff with. You're not connected with anyone. And that was me. I felt that. There was one psychologist that had been on the base with me, but she was, that I'd become friends with, but then she got just rotated to another base, just had already been planned. And the other social workers I just didn't really have any connection with and couldn't really talk to them about it. And the other doctor that was on base, we just couldn't really talk that much about it.
You've written about another case that happened there that I think also is kind of the exact opposite of what happened with the first guy, but they both exemplify the powerlessness, I think, that we share as psychiatrists. So the first person killed himself, and he was your patient, but you didn't see it coming. He wasn't in your top worry list. And then you've written about another soldier who told you exactly what he was going to do. And I wonder if you might share that story.
This first sergeant that I developed a kind of a friendly relationship with after that suicide, I just brought him straight to me, bypassed, the enlisted techs. They were saying, hey, wait a minute, we have to talk to Doc. And he's like, no, get out. He was a senior sergeant guy. He's like, get out of my way. And just brought him in, set him down, said to me, hey, Doc, this guy needs to talk to you. He just, someone walked in on him while he was about to kill himself. He didn't really want to talk to me, but he was respectful and nice. He didn't completely shut down, but he just said in a fairly calm way, hey, Doc, I know you got to do your job. I don't blame you. I'm not holding it against you, but I'm just going to bide my time. I'm going to kill myself later. I know you're probably going to send me off base, probably send me, even out of Iraq, and I'll be hospitalized, but, I'm just going to play well, like, I've changed my mind and everything's good, and then I'll kill myself. And he said this sort of like he knew the system very well, and he had just thought it through. I don't know if he had talked to someone, or he'd never been hospitalized or anything, as far as I could tell. I'd never even seen anyone in mental health in the Army before, in the military. And the way he was just saying it just raised the hair on the back of my neck so much more than any other patient, maybe even since then. And, I sensed that he was not ambivalent at all. Like, I would always, with suicidal patients, find some part of them, some sense that they wanted to live, and try and work with that and help that, encourage that, help that grow, sort of to increase their ambivalence about suicide. And he just felt like he had none whatsoever. And he just reminded me of when I was in medical school. I did a month of forensic pathology as an elective, and it was in between the holidays in December, and we saw a lot of completed suicides. And, the pathologists say, this time of year we would get a lot. And he just reminded me of that. Like this guy never had any intention of coming to see anyone to talk about, well, maybe I don't want to do this. I mean, he was set. And, it really kind of scared me, and probably because I was still very edgy from the last one. I did all I could. We took took the firing pin out of his weapon. I put a watch on him. Even I didn't know it, but when I was talking to him, his company commander was already starting to make arrangements to get him off base, and because he already knew about it. And He got medevaced out after 3 or 4 days. He left our base and went on to probably Balad or somewhere with a major hospital, and then eventually to Germany to Landstuhl, where that's the closest military psychiatric ward. There wasn't one in Kuwait or anywhere in Iraq at the time. I thought about him some, but he didn't dwell with me as much as the first one, because I didn't really know this guy that much. I just seen him then. I talked to him every day until he left. He didn't feel like my patient as much. It was like I was seeing him in an emergency room and handing him off. Then I found out from that first sergeant about 2 months later, he and I were talking right before I was leaving Iraq, and I asked him about the guy, and he kind of looked away from me and then said, yeah, I just heard a few days ago that, they kept him in the hospital for over a month, sent him to their rear detachment, it's called, for their unit. They were supposed to keep an eye on him, and they were, and he got away from someone and hung himself in a bathroom, like 3 days after he was discharged from the hospital. Exactly kind of as he said he was going to. Yeah, it was heartbreaking. It was tough, but it felt a little different to me because I felt like I had done all I could.
Yeah, right. But again, knowing that you've done all you could and someone still dies, I think it's such a reality of our work that ultimately it's mostly not in our hands.
Yeah, and I afterwards, I think I had read, it was Clint Gabbard, in either an article or one of his textbooks talking about how psychiatry does deal with terminal illness, and you have to think about it at times. And people don't like to think about it or don't consider psychiatric disorders terminal illnesses, but they can be. They are, and we have patients die too. And it's part of the work, but it's still very tough when it happens.
Yeah. So how are you feeling and functioning as a psychiatrist for the rest of your tour then?
I was getting increasingly detached, down. I was still functioning. I think I was getting more conservative, like I said earlier, that psychiatrists often do after suicide. I don't think I was openly suicidal at that point, but I was, looking back, I would say I had like passive thoughts of death, passive thoughts of suicide. Like I wouldn't mind if I died. And there were times where, we, on the base at night, you're supposed to wear reflective stripe. It's like an army rule, so you don't get run over by, trucks, because we're no street lights or anything. I would just stop wearing that sometimes. And one truck nearly hit me once. I didn't really care. They stopped actually and got out and was going to yell at me, and then saw my rank and was like, "Oh, sir, well, you need to wear your vest. You need to wear your stripe." And I said, "Whatever, fuck off." Yeah. And I just kept walking. I had reached that sort of state of mind. I was just trying to make it through, and I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop, in a sense. I was waiting. I was trying to keep it from dropping. I thought there would be another suicide, and I was trying to keep it from happening on base again. And it felt like a tremendous amount of weight.
Yeah. I'm guessing it's pretty hard to enjoy your work when you're operating in this sort of climate of kind of numbed fear, hypervigilance.
It was, and strangely at times it was the most rewarding probably that I had in the military, that people, besides all that happening, there were soldiers that would thank me for being out there, that they would say that they had better access with seeing me than they had access to care through the VA or through on base back home, or like reservists who were, seen in the VA. They said, "Well, you have better. I can see you so much easier than I can anyone back home." They'd say shit like, who knew I'd have to go to a war zone to get mental health care, and that was felt good, and they would thank me and stuff, but. All this was still weighing on me for sure.
How was your transition back home?
It's tough. I knew it could be tough. There's always in the military they talk a lot about how it can be hard to get back in sync with your family. Your family's in a routine without you being there. They're used to you not being there. They want you back and they're excited, but it can be also hard for you to fit back in. But that's usually might last maybe a week at most, and then it goes away. There was definitely some of that there, but it's also compounded by much more. I was still thinking about the first soldier that I'd lost, and how maybe could I have done something differently. I had felt kind of guilty about leaving because I left, but my whole team that I had been embedded with was still there. They were there for 15 months, and doctors rotated every 6 months, but everyone else on the team had to stay. And so I thought a lot about them. I thought a lot about patients that were still there. I had gotten this award in residency through the American College of Psychiatrists. It's like this fellowship that they give that I'd won. And you're supposed to go back to their annual meeting for 2 years as part of it. And I'd gone the first year while I was at PGY4, and then I was supposed to go the following spring. And so I had left Iraq maybe a week early or so in order to go to that. And I had sort of pushed a lot. It had all been sort of worked out, and but I felt sort of bad about that. And then as I was leaving, I had to stay at FOB Diamondback for several days waiting on a flight from Mosul back out of there to Kuwait. And we were just mortared heavily. And, in the housing units, temporary housing units where I was staying, some of them were just randomly hit and people killed in them. It was just a matter of, which one I was assigned, whether I had been killed or not, or if I had gotten up. There's so many false alarms. You're supposed to put on your body armor and go outside in the middle of the night and find the concrete coveys, kind of half pipes really to crawl under and set in. And after a while, there's a lot of false alarms. And after a while, you think, wow, fuck, do I really want to get out of bed again for another false alarm? Or this could be a real one. All the stress of that was really weighing on me. And I just remember just feeling so ready to go and being so unable to go and having no control over it, sitting there while we're being mortared. And we get home from Iraq, and I'd leave literally a day or two later to go to Tucson to get this award. And we get there, and Tucson, other than those big ass cactuses, it looks a lot like Iraq. And that just really was very kind of disorienting and made me feel even more still back in Iraq, not really back home. And I go to get this, I go to this conference, and I still could feel like it felt like the phantom weight of my 9mm that was normally on my right hip, in a holster. I could still feel like the phantom weight of it, kind of like, and I would like reach for it at times, or just, put my hand on it, just make sure it was still there type thing. I'm still feeling that. And, we go around the circle as other fellowship recipients, and, they were just coming out of like civilian residencies or whatever. And I say, yeah, I just got back from Iraq, and I'm used to having a 9mm on me right now, and it feels really kind of weird to be here and not have it. And part of me still feels like I'm back there, and all these people are all these like other psychiatrists just staring at me like, holy fuck. And some of them come up to me, with this afterwards with this kind of, oh wow, that must be really cool. You were at war kind of thing. I was just like, you just don't fucking get it, man. Mm-hmm. And I just didn't want to hear any of it. I've had patients tell me about that, like people coming up to them saying, oh, how many did you kill? And it's like, you just don't get it, and I felt that way. And I just felt very detached from all of them. And I started feeling intensely suicidal for several days. And it wasn't like I didn't feel depressed. I felt angry. And it had like this, I just want fucking out of here. I wasn't feeling connected to my family, my wife. She was sort of excited to be there in Tucson and, be, doing tourist sort of stuff. And none of it mattered anymore. I was stuck back in Iraq. I was traumatized, time had kind of collapsed for me, stuck back there. I wasn't moving forward. And I sort of realized that. I realized I was not I wasn't where I felt I should be, and I wasn't connecting with who I wanted to be. It was just a terrible feeling, and I just wanted it over, and I just wanted out of it, and I wanted it to end. I just started having thoughts like I could drive, I could take a rental car and drive it somewhere. I would just find myself thinking, how can I kill myself? How can I kill myself here? I don't have a gun. I don't have, my family's with me. I'd have to get away from them. Started thinking through the process, thinking through what I would do, and thinking, I would take a rental car somewhere and wreck it or something like that. Take my seatbelt off and just drive it into something or do something like that. And just feeling very angry that that's where I was, that's where, but I didn't see any other way. I didn't want to stay where I was in that state of mind. And what sort of brought me out of it was our son, in a lot of ways. Towards the last night, they had this like dinner, kind of farewell dinner type thing, and they put these little, they're supposed to be like little flower basket things on every table, but these were these had like a cactus in them, and they looked pretty and everything. And our son was 5 at the time. He thought it looked really cool, and he wanted it, and he reached out to grab it, and he didn't realize that was a real cactus with real thorns, and he just put his hand on it, and he pulled it back, and he had all these thorns just stuck all through his hand, and he just started screaming, crying, and just his pain kind of brought me out of it. Like, I really have to fucking be here for him, and I loved him. I wanted to be there, and so I kind of started pulling out of it at that point.
We've seen in story after story this common thread of hopelessness emerging from disconnection and alienation. And I think through these 5 seasons of Back from the Abyss, we've also seen that the common factor that pulls people out of their darkness is connection. Connection to a loved one, a pet, to God, to a 12-step sponsor, a caring therapist or doctor, someone or something, even ketamine. To be utterly convinced of our worthlessness or hopelessness or shamefulness, we need to believe that we are truly alone. Each of us can be part of the solution here, for when we connect meaningfully to others, we buoy them, and they buoy us, and that's the power of caring. That's the power of loving others.